Beyond Resilience is a series of curated conversations created by Firelight.
Beyond Resilience does a lot to keep people connected and keep people talking about films or talking about issues, connecting our filmmakers and other filmmakers together.
We wanted to create a space where our community, that is BIPOC documentary filmmakers, could lead a conversation.
We have to do a better job of knowing that films aren't just what we can physically see on the screen. It's about the people that put in the blood, sweat, and tears behind the scenes.
Knowing that what you're so passionate about, someone looks at as unmarketable or niche. Who's the audience for this? Who's going to care about this, right? And those simple things that people say are like daggers to you.
I think that is the part of the violence of the model minority shit, that it like shaves away our history of resistance, of rebellion, of ferocity.
We have always resisted. We have always fought back in many different forms.
It's an evolving form. You have to evolve, or not you will stagnate.
You have to have intention to change, and you have to understand that you're not changing to try to give anybody a gift, but you're changing so that you can do your job better.
What we're asking for is just proportional access, proportional resources, proportional marketing money, so that it does actually meet its mission, so that it does actually lean into the diversity of perspectives.
I hope that Beyond Resilience will keep its edge, will keep pushing the boundaries of the conversations that we need to have, and will keep growing its audiences, pulling in new people from the industry, outside the industry. It continues to be a space where people can have a BIPOC creator-led conversation. That is what it's about. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Happy New Year. I know it feels old. With so much heartache and tension in the world, I sincerely hope you and your loved ones are safe and finding some sources of light in your lives. My name is Marcia Smith. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the co-founder and president of Firelight Media. I joined this event from Harlem in New York City on the land of the Munsee Lenape people. At Firelight Media, we stand in solidarity with Indigenous people worldwide and take every opportunity to remind our audience about Indigenous sovereignty and land rights. I encourage you to follow the link in the chat to learn about whose ancestral lands you are joining this event from. Please feel free to share your own land acknowledgement in the chat if you wish. I am a Black woman with a kind of poofy afro, a green sweater, and blue glasses. Today's event is part of a continuing series of conversations we began in March of 22, centering perspectives of Muslim and Manasa communities in the documentary field. This particular conversation is born from our November 2023 Beyond Resilience event around the ethics of artificial intelligence, which took place at Doc NYC Pro. When enumerating the many ways in which BIPOC folks can be harmed by inaccurate or incomplete data that can misrepresent or fail to account for entire cultures, AI researcher Tess Thorson asked, how will Muslim communities be represented in film data if all that the computer knows are those films set in yellow-hued deserts? That's a problem. And so our Beyond Resilience producers were prompted to ask, what are the optics of Islam? More to the point, what are the optics of Islam when created by filmmakers and film protagonists with firsthand knowledge of the Muslim and Manasa experiences? And that's what brings us here today. Knowing that Muslim and Manasa communities are not monolithic and span the globe, how can we better understand the breadth of their experiences? What documentary films and series resist these stubborn tropes and reflect new modes of representation for Muslim and non-Muslim audiences? And what can we learn about the importance of positionality, representation, and accuracy from films by, for, or about Muslim and Manasa communities? With the recently announced investment of $4.5 million from the Doris Duke Foundation to our partners at the Center for Asian American Media to help amplify diverse Muslim narratives and provide filmmakers with a platform to share their work, we hope that the tide is turning. But we also know that much more needs to be done to better support Muslim and Manasa filmmakers and the audiences, the broad audiences, for their work. This will not be our last conversation in collaboration with these filmmakers. For example, as was brought to our attention by an audience member, even this discussion, we did not account for the experiences of Black Muslim filmmakers. So there's more to come. I am grateful to today's panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment, for joining. Actually, I won't, but I'll introduce our moderator, for joining us to discuss these issues. Before that, a special thank you to our ASL interpreter, Sharon Pierre-Louis. Also a big thank you to Jean-Pierre Regis, our series curator, and Justin Sherwood, Firelight's communications director. For closed caption services, please see the lower right-hand corner of your YouTube screen. Lastly, a special thank you to our ongoing Beyond Resilience series supporters, including Open Society Foundations, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Field of Vision for making these conversations possible. Now, I have the pleasure of throwing it to our moderator for this conversation, Farihah Zaman, who will then introduce the rest of our panelists for today. Farihah is a queer Bangladeshi American filmmaker, critic, educator, and curator who produced Sundance Award-winning Netflix original Ghosts of Sugarland, which was shortlisted for a 2020 Academy Award nomination. Farihah has written for Reverse Shot, Film Comment, Elle, Huffington Post, Filmmaker Magazine, and AV Club. Farihah programs Infinite Beauty, an ongoing monthly series at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City that showcases the breadth of Muslim Manasa storytelling on screen, and was the documentarian in residence at Bard College from 2018 to 2019. Was named the top 40 under 40 filmmaker by Doc NYC. I'm going to run out of breath. Was a Rockwood Leadership Fellow and is a member of the documentary branch of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Thank you, Farihah, for doing this, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, Marcia, Justin, and all of the Firelight team and our amazing ASL interpreter for offering this platform. This is a conversation that I always want to have, that I get to have among Muslim filmmaking community and the people who love them, but we need to have this conversation more publicly. I think this question of the optics of Islam absolutely intersects with what we're seeing in terms of the denial or even support of the genocide that's happening in Palestine. And it's really important that we continue to highlight the complex, real, and diverse lives of Muslim American and Arab filmmakers. So much appreciated. And I want to share a little bit about each of the panelists today before we open up the discussion. Firstly, Jude Chehab is a Lebanese-American filmmaker whose cinematic interests have drawn her to the exploration of the esoteric, the spiritual, and the unspoken. She's worked as a DP internationally on films in Somalia, Sudan, and Pakistan, and was an AP on Sesame Street's show Ahlan Simsim for Syrian refugees, which I didn't know, Jude. That's amazing. Jude's first feature documentary, Q, was named one of the best documentaries of 2023 by Vogue magazine, was supported by Firelight Media, IDA, ITVS, TFI, and the Sundance Institute. It won the Albert Maysles Award for Best Documentary Director at Tribeca and the Grand Jury Award for Best First Feature at Sheffield DocFest. The film was nominated for 2 IDA awards and very recently won a Cinema Eye honor. Li Lu was born in Suzhou, China, and raised in Sugar Land, Texas. Her award-winning projects have been supported by Firelight Media, Sundance, Ford Foundation, Austin Film Society, Gotham, the Center for Asian American Media, and others. Her narrative feature, television, and documentary work can be streamed on Hulu, Disney+, Amazon, and Netflix. I recommend you check all of those out. A lover of all storytelling, Lee strives to create bold and fearless projects spanning genre and form. Finally, Dr. Maha Hilal is a Muslim Arab American and an expert on institutionalized Islamophobia, the war on terror, and counter-narrative work. She is the author of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim American Experience Since 9/11, and her writings have appeared in Vox, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, The Daily Beast, and Truth Out, among others. Dr. Hilal is the founding executive director of Muslim Counterpublics Lab, an organization that works to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. Dr. Hilal earned her doctorate from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at American University in Washington, D.C. So we have a real Legends Only panel. I want to start by speaking to you, Jude, but before we do that, can we please show a clip from her recent feature documentary, Q?
ليش عم تكبوا هون الزبالة؟ من فضلك ليه عم تكب زبالة هون؟
معك مكتوب هلا؟ مين بعت لك الرسالة؟
الشيخة الكبيرة.
فيك تقري على العالم؟ ليه متوتر هلا؟
ماني موترة عادي. دكتورة هبة خضر، نحن يا هبة متبعون ولسنا مبتدعون. طريقنا سهل ومضيء، تركتم على المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها زائغ. نحن حريصون عليك كما أنت حريصة علينا، ونحن نتواصى بالحق والصبر. طريقك يا هبة طويل وخطير، ولا يوجد سلام مع المخالفة. يقلب الله النتائج والنهايات، ولكن لا يصل التلفت. ما جعل الله شفاء أمتي على ما حرم عليه.
ليه ما بتقولوا اسمهم؟
ما بعرف، هيك تعودنا.
Beautiful. Jude, thank you so much for joining today. And I wanted to start by talking about Q, actually, because I know that it was a film with a long journey and it's extremely personal. It required a lot of resources to come into the world. And I know that you've spoken about the ways in which there were perhaps expectations about what this story, your story, should look like based on a dominant culture perspective. Can you talk about what it was like trying to explain what film you wanted to make and garnering support for it?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. So special seeing the clip. Yeah, I think it's funny. I feel like everyone now knows that I vent a lot about the process of making it, but I think it was a journey for me. I think when I started, I was very naive, and I think I kind of really read into people wanting these Muslim stories and not questioning too much about that. And making this film, I mean, from the outside, it could be a very traditional cult film, and we did the opposite of that. And so the whole time making the film, truly at every stage, there was pushback and there was questioning and expectations of oh, this audience doesn't even understand Islam. Give us Islam 101. We don't even understand hijab. Explain that. And it was just like mind-boggling to think that I have to have a film that has to represent the entire religion, has to explain everything, and also has to explain everything about this group. And yet we didn't do that. And we realized how much the more that we explain about the group, the less people do know. And so I think there was moments, my husband's the one who edited it. And I remember there was a moment in the edit room, for example, where I was so stressed and I was thinking about all the feedback that we had gotten. Well, this doesn't make sense to these people, and this doesn't make sense to these other people. And then he just said, what was the film you wanted to make? And let's make that film. And I think the biggest secret was that I always knew the film that I wanted to make. So part of it was just figuring out how to tune out that noise while making it.
And I think the recognition and accolades you've received, not to mention the way in which you've received feedback from the people that this film is for, really speaks to how valuable it was to sort of stick to your vision and your principles. I think many of us can relate to this experience in one way or another, where your identity is expected to sort of perform a particular function in the larger culture. And I wonder, when you were in the middle of those conversations, what did you say? What can you offer in terms of how to navigate that?
I think definitely listening. Like, I was listening. I mean, not everything was trying to be closed off. I think it was a matter of also taking the time to reflect on that feedback and realizing, like, what is this feedback trying to say and who's it coming from and what is that intention? And I think the feedback that made sense for the film is what stuck. And that's what always kind of lingered in the back of my mind. And so I think in those conversations, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I was ever telling people like, I don't think I was directly being like, that doesn't make sense to this community. I was finding ways to explain, like this nuance. I remember, for example, just a quick example, people would tell me like, take out these humor moments. Like there's a couple moments in the film where they'll be praying and crying. My dad will cut to being like, hey, Google, what time is it? And it's just like, how to take these moments, why are all of our stories suffering and just the pain? Like I have to have, this is the life of someone who is spiritual and someone who's religious. And I have to honor that if I want to give justice to my mother's story.
Absolutely. And we know that not every film that features Muslim lives needs to engage with that question of identity. And your film does not only do that, but it is something that it does, is engage with questions of spirituality and Muslim identity. And I'm curious if you can speak to this question of the ways in which your background and your relationship to Islam informed even how you made the film, even aesthetically. Do you think that's part of your filmmaking practice?
Oh, 100%. It's all part of it. A mentor of mine, Bassem, who you know, Farihah, was always like that. He is like looking for God in cinema, and I've always felt that way. Even with the images. I mean, I felt very inspired by even going to Alhambra in Granada and seeing that the way the Muslims were building things and how everything had purpose. And I think with this film, that was the case. Every scene, every shot, when we cut in, had to have purpose and intention. And so much of my spirituality, I feel, is in the film because we didn't focus on a linear storyline. We focused on the emotional aspect of her life and that journey. And that definitely is mirroring how I feel in wanting to reflect the state of the heart.
Thank you so much. Lee, I wanted to talk more about your film and practice, but first, can we show a clip from Lee's film, A Town Called Victoria?
I have a 33-year-old son, actually soon to be 33. His name is Sharif. Decided that he wanted to enlist in the army. He did a tour in Mosul. He lost some friends to IED. That tragedy kind of impacted him quite a bit.
Okay, so there's a function called Warriors Weekend, and I felt obligated to sponsor a flag in his honor. The flag is displayed in the Field of Honor next to Parkway Baptist Church. This is a very cherished flag to me.
It's important that boys understand that flag is not a piece of cloth. If we don't teach them, then boys will be boys, and when they grow up, they'll never know to be anything more than that. We've got to teach them to be men.
Sharif did go through a cycle of trying to prove his masculinity. I have faced lots of challenges raising my son. I first came to the States in '83. 2 years later, I was married to my wife at the time, and 9 months later, I had Sharif. We were self-employed, and there were some struggles with my first marriage, and I wasn't necessarily able to spend a quality time with my son. At the same time, my mind was somewhat occupied with my parents overseas in Lebanon with the civil war going on.
Muslims and Christians opened another round of war on each other.
That careful balance in government between the country's religious factions has collapsed.
My uncle and my cousin get killed in a car bomb. My son is currently, I believe, in Houston. The last I know, is trying to figure out his life. You know, oftentimes we as parents are put in a position that we never asked for, just simply because we are parents. Vincent's parents, I truly feel for them.
Beautiful. Lee, I think one of the great things about the beauty and the sensitivity of your film is that it also shows that the answer to the question, how do we have appropriate and respectful and meaningful Muslim representation, isn't you're only allowed to make films about the community that you hail from, which I think is actually an argument that's typically used to shut down conversations about responsible and ethical documentary filmmaking. Can you talk about finding your way to this film and how you approached making a film about a community that is one that you're still learning about and one that you know has a lot of stereotypes that are attached to it as is?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for including me as part of this very important discussion as an ally. This incident happened about an hour away from where I grew up in Texas, and someone that I had known from high school had extended family that they were part of this mosque or members of this mosque. So when it had happened, it felt like it was happening in our collective backyard in a way. And as soon as I got to Victoria, I just felt so much. I felt like my family and I's experience in this region of Texas was so similar to so many different narratives and backgrounds in this vibrant community. And I knew that there was a more important story to tell also about our collective history in this region, the fact that we've been here, and the fact that our representation as part of the American fabric is important to tell through, in this case, through the lens of what had happened in Victoria, Texas. And that sort of similarity and heart-to-heart empathy that we felt as makers of the series and as participants, I think, was, to me, the most important and the most vital thing to getting the story right and to serving the core audience of the series.
And, something that's interesting, I'm sure you're not new to the experience of having expectations of what kind of story you should tell as a BIPOC woman, but you found yourself experiencing the specificity of what people are asking for, or the reductive asks of a story about Muslim and Minasa people. Can you speak to some of the kinds of challenges that came up and what you noticed trying to get this film made?
Yeah, kind of what Jude had mentioned, this sort of idea of pressure, the pressure to have this Islam 101 as part of the narrative of the series, when it was very important for this story for us to portray the individuals that were walking this very difficult path of sorting through this hate crime, trying to find restorative justice. That was what we were focused on. But there were tons of notes and perhaps I would say microaggressions about how we were telling the story, what to include, things that didn't really feel like we're serving the core audience of what the series was for. and falling into tropes or topics that had to do with stereotypes that never was the reason why I wanted to make the thing, to make the story, to share the story in the first place. And that was a challenge throughout.
Isn't it amazing? You don't have to be of the community to understand that a stereotype is being expressed and pushed on you. And I want to talk about the other side of this perspective, which is conversely, the audiences that you were making the film for gave you a lot of feedback about how it was meaningful to them and how they saw themselves in those stories. And could you highlight some of what people expressed that they were longing to see and did in your film?
Yeah, one of the most memorable and honestly rewarding notes that we've had in our community screenings or people who watch the series on PBS is that they've expressed to us that they've very rarely seen, especially Muslim men, being depicted with so much vulnerability. The clip that we showed is where we dive deeper with Omar Rashid, who's one of our main characters. He's a community leader in Victoria, and of course, a member of the Islamic Center, and his relationship with his son, who had served in the army. And in the series, it's part of a larger section where Omar, talking about fatherhood, is juxtaposed also with the father of the suspect. And we learn that they share a lot of similarities about how they feel about their father-son relationships. And as you can see, very complex relationships with patriotism and masculinity and failure. So I think that to me has been one of the best notes we've had. And also just to feel like all the things you were fighting for, to keep the nuance and to keep the specificity of certain things. It can be so small as, you know, a sound edit or a shot that you wanted to linger on for a little bit more to let the action of prayer complete, that ultimately in the act of showing the film to audiences, they were noticed and they were definitely appreciated. That's what's kept me going, and it's also things I'm banking for myself to really not let me forget that those things are so worth fighting for and should be protected with every film, every project.
We appreciate your work. Dr. Maha, we don't have a clip for you, but I just want to say that everyone should read Innocent Until Proven Muslim, not just because of its relationship to this conversation, but because I think it says a lot about the sort of modern era of global politics that we're in. That incident foreshadowed a lot more than just the response to the Muslim world. I want to talk about the framework with which you approach these questions. But first, because we were just talking about a town called Victoria, could you share how you worked with Lee to create an impact strategy to reach out to those audiences that, again, the film was made for?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to thank Lee, especially for bringing me into this conversation, and all of you. It's, great to be with such an incredible group of filmmakers, especially since I'm not one. And so, I was in touch with Lee through an organization called the Islamic Scholarship Fund, and was approached to look at the resource guide and to think about the ways in which, the conversation around a town called Victoria could speak to the different elements of the film, and in particular, right, the representation of Muslims, what questions people should be asking about Muslims, right? What are the conversations we need to have? And I really appreciated Lee bringing me into this conversation, because as a Muslim watching the documentary, I had a lot of questions, right? And one of the questions I had, and one of the thoughts that kept surfacing was, the way that the Muslim community responded to this attack on their mosque, right? They responded with such acceptance, such patience, right? And I think a lot of compassion. And obviously that was their genuine reaction to what had happened to their community. But at the same time, it made me think, what would have happened if their response was just anger, right? What would have been said in the narrative? And when we think about that particular point, right, what's unfortunate about whether we're writing about Muslims, whether we're making films about Muslims, is that we're always taught and sort of forced to tell our stories through this dominant narrative that's been constructed about who Muslims are, right? The Muslims are uncivilized, right? The Muslims are barbaric. The Muslims are opposed to normative democratic ideals, right? The Muslims are all of these negative things. And so we can't just tell a story about growing up Muslim in the United States, right? It has to be through this lens of what's been said about us, in particular, right, in the last 20 plus years, throughout the course of the war on terror and the way that the United States responded to the 9/11 attacks. And so it brings to my mind, right, a lot of questions, right? Not just about when we're telling and we're able to tell these authentic stories, but the fact that we're still telling them in a very problematic narrative infrastructure that diminishes a lot of the ways we should be able to express ourselves and the way our communities want to be perceived, right?
So much there. Can you maybe unpack where this dominant narrative is coming from? I know it's difficult to summarize, but what is the investment in upholding these kinds of narratives about us? You know, I when I have to really summarize it, describe it as like a fixation on a relationship between Islam and violence, that's the only type of story that exists. Why do people want to see us that way and uphold those narratives?
Well, as you know, we all know, right, there's a vested interest from the state and the media that's complicit with the state, right, to promote certain narratives about the Muslim community that legitimize and justify state violence against us. And that is the express purpose, because there are specific tropes that are utilized, right, such as Muslims are inherently angry. Well, what happens if Muslims are inherently angry? What is the purpose of putting out that construction? The purpose is to say that we can't reason with these people. They're irrational, right? We can't understand. And therefore, the only intervention is brute force and violence. And that's exactly what we've seen throughout the war on terror, right? And when we characterize Muslims as evil, evil is meant and is used as an innate, inherent characteristic, again, which is used by the state and the media to suggest that there is no explanation for anything that Muslims do, and that therefore gives the state, again, the legitimacy to intervene with violence. So we have to kind of also, you know, when we look at policy, right, and all of these films get at that in different ways, right? When we look at policy, we have to understand the narrative infrastructure that supports the violence of these policies, because that is what it's intended to do, because you have to get the acquiescence, right? You have to make people acquiesce. You have to make people complacent. You have to make them believe that the only way we can deal with Muslims is through brute force and state violence. And in the war on terror, the United States has been remarkably successful in doing just that.
And as a way of transitioning into being able to focus on what we do want to see, what we want to focus on and build, what do you think is needed to shift that narrative? You know, I'm glad that you mentioned the Islamic Scholarship Fund, these conversations about how we resource ourselves and each other and sort of build our own frameworks is really important. And I'm curious to hear, because you have such a broad understanding of the impact of culture in shaping perspective and policy. What do we need to do to make this move towards the direction of, you know, real liberation?
Well, there's a lot we need to do. And you know, I'm grateful to be in a space with all of you who are doing exactly this work. But one of the things I focus on in particular is deconstructing dominant narratives, right? And the assumptions on which they're built. And there's a particular one I focus on a lot, which is the idea that state violence is inherently more moral and superior to non-state actor violence. And what is the purpose of that narrative, right? We always have to think about what is the express purpose of those narratives. And the purpose is to let state violence go unfettered, right? And to qualify the state's violence in very different terms than we do the violence of non-state actors, right? And again, it legitimizes this violence towards our community when we do that. But people take it for granted that state violence is legitimate, right? Because the state is supposed to have a monopoly on the use of violence. So I think that's one of the things, right? Really deconstructing those fundamental assumptions, right? Not accepting the narrative that we were sold about 9/11, it being about other groups hating our freedoms, our democracy, right? But listening to what they've said, right? There are narratives that explain grievances, and we have to understand those. So really deconstructing these dominant assumptions. And then I think simultaneously, which is what all of you have done incredibly well, right? Is to tell our stories in a way that doesn't have to respond to these dominant narratives, right? Why do we have to write a book? Why do I have to write a book? Why do you have to make a film, right? In which these narratives are omnipresent and limit the scope through which we can push back, through which we can challenge and tell our own stories. So I think that those are two things. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, as someone who's studied internalized Islamophobia as well, insofar as it contributes to the perpetuation of institutionalized Islamophobia, one thing Muslims need to do in particular is to unlearn a lot of the ideas that have been imposed upon us and to think critically about what they are promoting and perpetuating to target their own communities, right? Whether it's engaging in the government in destructive and damaging ways, right? Whether it's, for example, accepting the idea of collective responsibility and only condemning acts of violence perpetrated by Muslims, but not by the state. There are a number of ways this is manifest, but really unlearning and critically pushing back, because if we don't, we are part of the same apparatus that is legitimizing the violence against our communities.
Yeah. I think one of the ways that the more complex narratives are held back is not just the narratives themselves, but also the form that we are beholden to certain ways of making films. And I was wondering, Lee or Jude, if that is something that you've encountered at all, the idea that you're also expected to make a certain kind of film, a certain kind of way.
100%. I feel that the only stories that we can tell that are worthy of being told are if they have certain tropes or if they relate to the West. If it's a Muslim group that skateboards, if it's a Muslim group that's in a band, you know, if they have something that makes it worth something to the West. And so falling under that, and even now, you know, after Q and trying to think of, you know, what is going to be the next project, there is a weight in the back of my mind that's always thinking, well, how is this going to be of interest to all these institutions that do support us? Because if it is this truly nuanced Muslim story that's coming from the region, it's just, I personally just don't think it's fully of interest to them unless it has that kind of spin to it.
Yeah, I think just the simple fact that not everything has to be for everyone, you know, like it's just so simple. And yet for stories about marginalized communities, there's this unbelievable pressure to make it relatable. And there's a weaponization of that word, I think, of what relatable actually means to whom, right? And there's something about this form in this country that's so tied to, I think, capitalist means. And this question of who is this for? Who can absorb this? And, you know, Dr. Hilal was talking about dominant spaces. Well, I'm thinking about dominant and prevailing spaces regarding distribution and exhibition. When we feel like there are audiences that we want to serve through our work, through our stories, we know they are there and they are hungry and needing to see a piece of their reality in these stories. How can we access those audiences in a way that feels sustainable and direct and authentic in every step of the filmmaking process? You know, I think so many great ideas never go into the next step because we feel there's just too many things that are working against us. It's not the right time for many different reasons. And it's a scary time right now in our quote unquote industry where we're facing so much conservatism in every definition of the term, while needing so badly, so passionately to tell our stories that are so urgent to us.
It's so right that all of this coded language is just a euphemism for like it's not white enough or it's not what I expected your story to be, right? Like this is what we want, this is what's relatable. And I'm going to turn your very challenging question back to you and whoever else wants to jump in, which is how do we find those spaces? How do we find and connect to the audiences that we know are there? Because when you successfully do so, your what you feel becomes more than what you feel, right? Like you've seen it in action. So how do we do that?
Yeah, I can go. I feel like we had so many beautiful screenings outside of festivals in the making of the film. We had one in Houston that Lee was actually at. And I think it's a matter of time and building that audience, but we slowly did it. And when that audience came out, it really allowed us to realize that this was the whole point of making the work. And these are the people that we wanted to see the film. And so I think it's about being intentional and purposeful and how we make the film, how we release it, how do we engage with the people that we made it for.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the energy of those spaces and rooms where you present your work, that is the reward. That is the authentic feeling of what you are trying to express has an impact on people. And, you know, for the rollout of our series, it was also very important for us to have in-person screenings, even though ours is a 3-part docu-series. We had this idea of how do we put this into a public forum through a screening? And it was all during, you know, the latter months of last year. So then we had this ultimate responsibility to make also these spaces feel as restorative and as community-led as possible. So we paired that also with, you know, seminars around mental health or creative workshops where we celebrated writing and, you know, art making. And the feeling that you were able to make this space for so many people, that is the true reward, I feel, of this kind of work. And the rest of it, whether it be recognition or awards or things like that, that's all great. But the reason why we're drawn to what we do as storytellers is to have an impact on people. And if you are able to do that, no matter how big the room is, then you are successful. And I always have to clue in on that as a barometer of our success.
That's something great for all of us to remember. And I want to touch on the fact that even when we do get there, even when we do find our people, the people who need this work, there can still be questions around safety because there is such an investment about the kinds of narratives that we're supposed to be telling. You know, even recently in film festival space, there have been stories about people being harassed for wearing keffiyeh in public, about this discussion of if you show up to this protest or you made this film, no one's going to distribute. You have to kind of continue to engage with kind of violence and pushback. And I was wondering, Maha, if you could speak to some of how you navigated that with Lee's film and the response to A Town Called Victoria.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, Lee's film is really, really powerful. And it's definitely a film that everyone who's watching should see. And, you know, one of the important things is specifically around the fact that it's centered on a hate crime, right? And the reason why that's important is because when we have these broader conversations about the context in which hate crimes occur in the context of state violence. And it's the state, right, that models the treatment of different communities and target groups that then sends a message to society about what is considered acceptable treatment. So the film is a good way to examine that connection, right? hate crimes don't come out of nowhere, right? Again, they come out of this context. So I think Lee's film is an excellent place to bring that up. And, just as Farihah just mentioned, right, the way that Arabs, Palestinians, and Muslims have been targeted, right, while Israel is committing a genocide in Palestine. There was the young 6-year-old boy who was killed by his neighbor. There were the 3 Palestinian students wearing kufiyas that were targeted by a random man. And the government loves to comment on those crimes, right? Because hate crimes, they can condemn Islamophobia, they can condemn anti-Arab bigotry in the form of hate crimes and make it look like they care about those systems of oppression on an institutional level when they do not. So that's why it's so important to have these conversations, is to bring the attention not only to hate crimes, but back to the state, again, that facilitated this context, and to hold them accountable. Because if you were really interested in dismantling and combating Islamophobia, anti-Arab bigotry, anti-Palestinian bigotry, you would do something other than facilitate a genocide in Palestine. And that's not what's happening. And so really, again, thinking about this intricate connection between state violence and hate crimes, and making sure people understand that, because you can't combat hate crimes alone without that context.
I feel like one of the other fallacies that we're told to accept is that we're building from scratch, and that a canon of work from Muslim filmmakers doesn't exist. So it's not only limiting the present and the future, but asking us to erase the past. And I was wondering from each of you, if you could speak to either work that's informed your practice and inspired you, or even just to talk about how to recenter what informs your work when that kind of work is not brought to us. It requires extra labor for us to find and recenter our own history and narratives.
I was very inspired by Kiarostami and Iranian cinema when I first got into filmmaking. I think it was subconsciously a way to see the Muslim experience the way I've never seen before, and in a way that it's not focused on the identity politics. At least with Kiarostami's work, it wasn't like all these characters just happened to be Muslim. And Nasser Khamir, a Tunisian filmmaker, is one of my favorites and struggled a lot to make his work, still struggles. I think he's like in his 80s now, but I always look back to him to see the way that his work has impacted me. And yet I know that he like went into debt to make the films that he's made, but and that Europe maybe never understood them, but that there are people like me one day that will go and find those films, and they're going to have this profound impact on a young filmmaker's life.
I have to say, I've drawn so much inspiration from our Firelight family. The work that is supported through Firelight and the filmmakers that we get to meet through our cohorts and funds and grants. I feel like the people that are making work in this enclave are creating some of the most boldest, most daring, most interesting films. I'm thinking about Sonia Kennebec. I'm thinking about Cecilia Alderando. I'm thinking about people within our class, Sean Pierre and Kevin Shaw, and just this beautiful wealth of voices and riches that we have with even our own cohort, and knowing that the work out there exists, and almost pulling people to see this incredible work and these incredible stories. I draw so much inspiration from them. And honestly, you know, I feel like I love this form because it makes me feel so close to another human being. You know, this is what visual storytelling is for me, what I keep coming back to. So anytime where I feel that closeness in any medium, whether it be television, films, you know, even podcasts, like that I pay attention to, because that then informs my practice as well and helps keep me humble to really listen to that voice deep down inside that keeps you honest about what kind of work you want to make and how it will impact other people.
Maha, anything that comes to mind for you in terms of existing work in the canon or in the cultural conversation that you want to uplift or recenter?
Well, I would say, first of all of your films, because films tell stories and disrupt narratives in ways that a book cannot, right? Or just writing cannot, because it's showing a story. And I think that's a really powerful way of combating narratives. Also for me, you know, one of the most powerful things is reading narratives from survivors of state violence. So for example, numerous survivors of Guantanamo and numerous survivors of hate crimes, right, have written their own accounts of what happened to them. And I think that those are extremely powerful rebuttals to the dominant and state narratives that have criminalized them, right, and used these constructions to sanction the violence against them. So it's like, what happens in these contexts, right, when people are being criminalized and they have the courage to directly say, that is not what happened to me. This is what happened to me. And that inspires me because they have so much to lose.
On this topic of not just what has existed, but work that continues to be out there from Muslim makers or more sort of considered narrative work around Muslim communities. We had a question from the chat around the film Four Daughters, and if anybody on the panel has seen this film and how that landed for you.
I haven't seen it yet. I need to.
Neither have I. Yeah.
I know that we'll all have an opportunity to see it because it was just nominated for an Academy Award. So I'd also be curious to follow up with Sabah, who asked this question, talk to you about that. In the meantime, I was wondering if building on what you were talking about, Lee, in terms of, you know, finding that inspiration among other filmmakers, part of the Firelight cohort, for example, about what it means to build community. So not just here's the work that you're doing, here are the filmmakers that you're looking at, but have there been ways in which even outside of the production process, but just finding other artists and the people who appreciate more considered work, how that's impacted you?
Yeah, I think that's everything. You know, our Firelight cohort, we actually just had another virtual Zoom hangout on Sunday because it's, you know, this work is so singular and it's so intense and it's incredibly hard, and therefore it can be extremely lonely, you know, especially if you're the one that's on call for a lot of it. As a documentary filmmaker, you feel like you're on call, you're serving a bigger moment, a bigger story. And I think this is one of our biggest, most beautiful things as filmmakers is how we find strength in our community. What is the peer-to-peer that we can rely on that feels not only genuine, but feels like essential to what we're trying to do all together. Without it, I don't know what my life would look like. I don't know if I would be able to make this work, to be honest, without that camaraderie and sense that there is a group of people trying to serve as much as you are.
Yeah, not to be dramatic, but I feel like I would have lost my mind without fellow artists that are, you know, going through the same challenges and struggles that I am as I'm making the film, and supporting the work and believing in the work and kind of helping me find my voice and sculpting my voice and seeing what's working, what's landing, what's not, and also just kind of being struggling artists together.
There is an interesting question that came up in the chat about Jude, I think you might be able to speak to this. As a Muslim artist, do you struggle with the types of music that you use in the films due to how sensitive of a topic music in Islam can be? In some, obviously, Islam is not a monolithic culture, but in some expressions of the religion, music, certain kinds of music can be considered haram.
Wow, interesting. Really getting into it. I think I was struggling with it with Q in different ways. It was more of like not wanting to fall under having the like we were talking about like the yellow hues in the beginning, also the oud coming in and hearing the nai, like the flu, and just like feeling automatically close your eyes. I'm in the Middle East, you know, and I think for us it was like going the entire other way, a lot of violin, and I think it was a way also for me to kind of mix that East and West, but not in the other way at all.
Well, I think we're reaching the end of our discussion, although I wish it would continue forever. Luckily, the Optics of Islam series will continue. And I just wanted to thank all of the panelists here today and Firelight again for offering this platform, adding so much to the Optics of Islam conversation. I always like to say that it's important for our work to engage with identity, but it's also important to recognize work where Muslim people just hang out and do life, and that is the fullness of the human experience that we all deserve to have depicted by us or on our behalfs at least. And I appreciate all of you putting out work that does that, and want to remind all the other makers who are watching the panel that just by staying true to your perspective as a Muslim filmmaker or someone of a Muslim background, you are doing an important radical work against a dominant narrative. So please continue to do that, and we just have to sustain and support each other. To learn more about Firelight Media and for more on the panelists and to see more Beyond Resilience conversations like this one, visit firelightmedia.tv. And since we have one more minute, I just want to name check again some of the amazing foundations that are offering support by and for Muslim communities, like Islamic Scholarship Fund, the Doris Duke Foundation. If any, those who work in film or make films are in the audience and want to participate in making media and actions to work against the genocide in Gaza, you can visit filmworkersforpalestine.com. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and we look forward to seeing the future conversations here from Firelight.